Hello and welcome everyone who is joining us live and those watching the recording. Today's webinar is looking through the objective lens, incorporating Indigenous knowledge into the classroom with our speaker, Dr. Megan Muri Mazariegos. My name is Elizabeth Johnson, the Native Initiatives Coordinator at SACNAS and an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. Currently, I reside in the ancestral homelands of the Acmia Otham and Peepash peoples. SACNAS is a fully inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization, SACNAS creates space where all members, volunteers, and partners feel they belong and can embrace their intersectional identities. SACNAS is based out of California, which is the original homelands to over 200 tribal nations, bands, and rancherias of Native American Indigenous people. We would like to take this time to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the various regions in which we all live and work, and honor the rich culture of the Indigenous people across the country. SACNAS Native Initiatives was awarded a one-year grant from General Motors to support the work the organization is doing to engage and establish relationships with tribal colleges and universities, TCU STEM programs, faculty, and students. Today's event was developed with the TCU community in mind, and we hope to continue to provide these opportunities to TCUs over the year. Now, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Megan Muri Mazariegos, an enrolled member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, and an enrolled and a member of the health science faculty at the Nebraska Indian Community College. This workshop will share methodologies and tips on how to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into classroom curriculum through collaborative discussion on course designing, from pre-semester preparation to post-semester feedback. It is now my honor and privilege to pass the virtual floor to our speaker.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the introduction. I am having a little bit of issue sharing screen or starting my video, but I think I can share my presentation. So here we go. Can everyone see my screen in presenter mode?
We see the slides and the slide deck on the side.
Okay.
There you go.
Awesome. Perfect. So now everyone, greeting from my native language. So as Elizabeth had mentioned, I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, and I work for the Nebraska Indian Community College, and they also work in partnership with the Pawnee Nation College. So really tying in my roots to Nebraska as well as the Indigenous people there. So for today, what I would like to do is share a little bit of background about where I come from, some of my perspectives, and then share some tips on how to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the classroom. I would also like to as we're going through the discussion about the classroom, I welcome, any of the chat. If you guys have tips, experiences, specific questions, I'll have certain marks to where I would like, to just encourage a little bit of discussion and see what your guys' experiences are. So a bit of an outline for my talk. I would like to just do a little introduction and just share with you guys where my perspective is coming from, as many of us walk different paths in life, and how we got to where we are today varies greatly. And I think that really matters to just share, where I came from, why, I view things the way I am, and how I'm sharing this knowledge with you guys. I then want to talk about why Indigenous knowledge is important and why we should be incorporating it in the classrooms, not just as TCUs, but in general. And then I'll get into the classroom. So how to start the semester off right, indigenizing the classroom as you're going through the semester, and then post-semester. So really getting that feedback, and feedback is good. So really encouraging our students to tell us what they thought about, our curriculum, things that we can change, things that they liked, ways that help them to learn, and so forth. And then we'll end with, more of a Q&A. So I'll start off with my origins. So I was born and raised in Oklahoma, and specifically, I really grew up in Cleveland, Oklahoma, which is located in Pawnee County. I don't know, can you guys see my mouse? Not sure. So I move it around.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so here is Pawnee County of Oklahoma. So this is in the northeastern corner. So many of you might be familiar with like Tulsa. So we're fairly close to that area. So Cleveland is right here located on this little hump of Pawnee County, and then Pawnee, Oklahoma, where my tribal headquarters is located, is right here in the center of Pawnee County and is Pawnee, Oklahoma. So it's just about 15-20 minute drive from my tribal headquarters. However, one thing to kind of point out is that even though I was an enrolled member of the Pawnee Nation and that, the Pawnee tribe, held, these are the tribal grounds over here in Oklahoma, Cleveland was a little bit of an exceptional town to where there wasn't much color there. It was a very, kind of white-based town. There's only a very few of us that were not white. And it really kind of affected the way that things were prioritized in my life. And I'll kind of bring that up more as we go along. But just a little bit about the Pawnee Nation and kind of tying it back to Nebraska. So Pawnees were originally located in Nebraska. Here is their kind of back in the 1800s. Right here was the Pawnee Reservation in the land of Nebraska. We were then relocated into Oklahoma, and that's where our tribal headquarters were set up in Pawnee, Oklahoma. And we were originally Earth Lodge people, so we lived out on the plains, but we built more permanent structures of homes. So here's an example here. To also kind of go into, so I did grow up in an unfortunately common household that many Indigenous people face, in which I came from a single parent, low income household. I grew up with my mother, who is Pawnee and Indigenous. Those of you who are familiar with NICC and PNC might know her. She teaches there as well. But she really tried to instill in me the importance of education. And then as I went through a primarily white, educational system as I grew up, I was really kind of driven towards the same goal. So really thinking about, okay, focus on school's a priority, make good grades, get scholarships, need to attend college. So this was really instilled in me from a very young age and really drove my next steps. So right after graduating high school, I went on what you kind of quote, a traditional academic journey. So after graduating high school, I immediately attended Oklahoma State University, go Cowboys, immediately after in that fall. I lived on campus. I didn't have any dependents. I was, fortunate to be able to receive enough scholarships and financial aid to where I didn't have to have an outside job. I didn't have to do work study. So all of my time was spent on my curricular activities as well as time spent in extracurricular activities. So this is where I really broadened out, and I participated in the Native American Student Association. I tried to, kind of tie back into my Indigenous roots, but mostly my education was really geared in, that kind of, like I say, traditional academia. I was driven in science. That's the area that I did well in. Kind of thought about being, a medical doctor, thought about research. I was fortunate to get the opportunity to conduct research from a very early stage in my education. And I really got involved in things such as science. I got involved in chemistry, biochemistry. And this also is where I really became fascinated with like Alzheimer's disease and neuroscience. So I was really building up, this kind of pathway that, it followed. It was kind of what was expected, or maybe showed the kind of standard pathway that you might see from a counselor at high school. And then with this, because I had all my time to really focus on my studies as an undergraduate, I was able to graduate within 4 years. and followed that traditional pathway. And because of that, I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD. So I decided to really change things up. So I went kind of looking, I went to interview at different schools. I had the opportunity to do an internship with the neuroscience program in Oklahoma, as I hadn't really thought about leaving, but had found that the environment wasn't really best suited for me. And so I decided to look at other universities and had settled on the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So I interviewed there, thought it was a good fit, had a lot of research going on, very pretty campus, very pretty place, a little bit cold. Me being an Okie, it was not the most pleasant winters. However, I was accepted, and so I moved to Wisconsin. But this transition also came with other transitions in my life. So I had a then boyfriend that we decided to get married before I moved. So I started a family, and I had a little bit of a surprise. So during my first semester, my husband and I had moved in. We settled into Wisconsin, no family there. We were by ourselves. I had learned during my first semester that we were expecting a little one, and this is actually here. This is her. So this is Carolyn. So this is my firstborn daughter. And she was a bit of a surprise. We didn't intend to start expanding our family quite so soon, but we were ecstatic. And both my husband and I, being from very rich cultures, we're excited to be welcoming the first grandbaby on my side and the new addition on his side. However, this really changed my traditional, quote, quote, academic trajectory. So with my new addition came new responsibilities. All of a sudden, academics wasn't first. I, couldn't just block everything out, just study, spend all my time, doing anything involved with school, getting involved in clubs and organizations. That really changed and that shifted for me. I had the responsibility of, I had a husband at home who, he wasn't attending college. Didn't want to leave him by himself all the time. It gets lonely, especially considering we didn't have family and we didn't really know anyone. And then with our daughter, she took up quite a bit of time. I chose to breastfeed her. So really finding the time and even place to pump while I was at school. And then even the program that I had picked is neuroscience. And on top of that, I had picked a very, what you would call kind of wet lab. So this is an instance where it's very in the laboratory. As you can see a picture here. So this is myself, as well as some other graduate students in my professor's lab. So this is really working on the bench top, doing sample analysis, mixing together chemicals. So this is a very intensive that you have to be there and work it. And so really having this shift of balance. So I had more important responsibilities was to my family and not so much academics. And that really caused a struggle for me. Because all of a sudden, what I could put on my resume wasn't necessarily applicable. I had to really gauge my time, I had to gauge childcare, and then even being driven away from my family, I didn't really have that, my community to help support me. And so this kind of showed me, kind of a glimpse of what, might consider a non-traditional student would face. There's extra hardships, and whenever you have responsibilities at home, academics and education might not be a top priority. And so with that, I really want to move into what it means to be a Pakskaet or a graduate in Pawnee. And so this kind of draws in, taking a step back and looking at the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the classroom. So for that, I want to kind of take a look at some statistics. So here I have a figure for one of the educational.gov websites. And this is undergraduate enrollment in degree granting post-secondary institutions by race and ethnicity and non-resident alien status. And in the dark blue, we have fall of 2009, and in purple, we have fall of 2020. And as we can see, this is in millions, so enrollment by millions. We can see that with the white population, in 2009, about 11 million were enrolling. And then in 2020, there was 8 million enrolling. But as you look down the line, if you look at Blacks and Hispanics, these numbers are much, much lower. And then looking at Asians, we see an increase, so they're actually visible on the bar. But as you continue down, we can see that Pacific Islanders and then the American Indian and Alaskan Native group are significantly small. Like they're not barely even registering, not even 1 million students are enrolling into these post-secondary institutions. And when we see these kind of statistics, we can really, start to think about why is this happening? Why are minorities, not participating in academia as, compared to the white counterparts, and really start to kind of make some hypotheses. This is data actually from NICC, looking at NICC students. And when we see NICC students, we can see that many and most of our students are actually what you would probably consider non-traditional. If we look at age, we can see that you're kind of typical 19 and under. And to move back, so NICC is a community college, so we offer certifications, and we also offer associate degrees. So very much in that undergraduate level. We're moving forward, and we got approved for a 4-year program. So our first bachelor's, which is, extremely exciting. But looking at our current statistics, we're seeing that in blue, only, probably about 1/3 of our students are actually falling into that kind of traditional category and attending school right after high school. Majority of our students, are not even just a few years older, but are in fact much older. So looking at our 35 and over. So these are people, that might have stepped away from the classroom for longer periods of time. They may have gotten started, decided, to take time off. They may have had other responsibilities coming out of high school. So many of them might not even have completed their high school diploma and maybe looking at GED. So these are students that didn't follow that traditional academic pathway. Also looking at our degree seeking students, we can see that actually a majority of our students have dependents. So a minor portion are without dependents, whereas the majority have dependents at home that they have to take care of and are responsible for. And in looking at our degree seeking students, we can see that most of them are actually part-time students. So you can see here that there's indication that our students are not just, deciding like, okay, we're going to go and we're going to get our certification, or we're going to get our associates in this instance, considered degree seeking, but they're instead, they're not able to maybe allocate the time to be able to do full time. So only a small portion of our students are actually being full-time, whereas the majority are part-time. Another instance here is that also most of our students are female. So many of these students, as we can imagine, that traditionally, in most cultures, the female parent is generally the default parent. So that means that they're generally the one with most of the child's rearing kind of responsibilities, mainly the ones that stay there with the kids, that cater to them. And then as well are the ones that, go through the process of childbirth in most instances, and are the ones that are primarily responsible. So we can see here with this, data that we can really infer that, okay, most of the students that are coming into NICC and are seeking a degree or to get their certification are considered non-traditional. So they don't have this, kind of opportunity, that I may have had whenever I was younger. So when I was able to leave and go directly into school and focus on my academics, our students may not have had that opportunity. And it is shown here. And then if we also think about why, going back to so many, Indigenous peoples, why they are not attending school, why they have other responsibilities, there is, evidence of generational trauma. And a lot of this stems from the boarding school eras where they had, essentially this motto to kill the Indian and save the man. So I had, my great grandfather was, a victim of this boarding school, and he was taken when he was young, forced into the boarding school at Pawnee. And, that really impacted the way he viewed things. So with my great grandfather, and then going back to the Pawnee language as well, there are no more fluent speakers of Pawnee. We have some records. We have, I have a little dictionary that has some of those recordings, but no one fluently speaks Pawnee anymore. My great grandfather was one of those last fluent speakers. And, kind of thinking back, I asked, my mom, why didn't he teach us? Why didn't he teach us the language? Well, the reasoning is that, he was a victim of this boarding school, and he was taught that, his language, it wasn't fit to be spoken, that his culture, that it, should be replaced by, the white culture. And due to this, he refused to teach, my grandmother, and he refused to teach my mother and my uncles. And so now, much of that language is lost. And his reasoning that he had told her whenever my mom had asked him is that, it's a white man's world. And so you're better fit to learn the white man way rather than our way to succeed. So this generational trauma, this mindset that, we're beneath white people, that we, don't, maybe we're not good enough, that, this educational opportunity isn't built for us. And in a way, that's true, that much of the traditional academics doesn't really consider a lot of this generational trauma, and that, like the way that curriculum is often designed, it really, is hard to keep up with unless you're able to focus, take the time and just singularly focus on your studies. So here I have some statistics, once again, talking about the consequences of assimilation. And here we just have a picture of, these, Indigenous representation being assimilated into, that more Western culture. So here I have some statistics that look at moderate to severe anxiety. And this is by race. So as we can see, in red is our white non-Hispanic race and ethnicity. And on average, kind of looking at through the years, their statistics are lower than all of the other groups. But if we pay special mind to this green up here, oop, lost my mouse, but this green line here demonstrates the Native American or American Indian group. And as we can see, for much of the time, it is the highest ranked, for races on their percent scoring for moderate to severe anxiety by this testing of GAD-7. If we look at depression, we have a similar instances where we have white, generally the lowest trend, whereas we have Native Americans generally ranking higher, and that is only really put to second if they're multiracial. And then for many of us, maybe that multiracial really encompasses a lot of Native Americans. As you can see that, much of the time, due to like enrollment, CDIB status, that we're having, kind of what you would consider maybe mixed blood. So we're having, kind of Indigenous people that whether they go with a different tribe and have a relationship and a marriage with a different tribe, or if they choose a different race, we're really having the issue of, kind of that blood quantum issue. So we're losing kind of that representation through CDIB, which in itself is a whole other kind of debate. But, just kind of in consideration that many of our, brothers and sisters of the Indigenous tribes probably fall into this peach color as well. And then for the next slide, I will warn a little bit that it does look at statistics for suicide. I know that this is a touchy subject, but it's just something that I wanted to share just to kind of show the general state of many of the Native Americans. So here we have statistics for ideation of suicide. And once again, we can see in the red that we have the lowest instances with white non-Hispanics. And once again, one of our primary statistics for the races fall within Native Americans and American Indians. Forward. So really looking at those statistics, we can see that this impact of generational trauma from the hardships that many Native Americans faced, including the boarding schools, instances of like the Trail of Tears, essentially genocide, it has been passed down through generations. And we're seeing these negative consequences and this negative mindset that many Native Americans are facing. And then to pursue something such as education, where they may have other responsibilities, they may have become, a mother at a young age, or, they're in a situation where they're in a very low income household, maybe even in poverty, and that they need to help work and bring money home to help support the family. Or maybe they have loved ones that they must take care of, like, their grandmother or other elders within the tribe. There are important responsibilities that they may hold. And when you're in that kind of situation, it's really survival that comes, most important. And education can often be viewed as a luxury. Oh, yes.
Hi, Megan. We actually have a couple questions.
Okay.
Could you explain a little bit more on the undiluted head count?
The undiluted head count. Yeah, so it's where there's no reciprocation. So every student only fits in one category. So instead of, if they may fit in multiple categories, they were placed in the category that best suited them.
Awesome, thank you. And also, we had a question about what motivated you to pursue a PhD?
Okay, yeah. So what really motivated me is another statistic that I didn't include in here, but my great grandmother, she developed dementia and then that progressed into Alzheimer's disease. And I witnessed this when I was, pretty young. I was probably, like less than 10 when she really started progressing. And I was really confused on her behavior. She started becoming, kind of aggressive. She didn't know who we were anymore. And just really seeing that decline, it just really made me question why. And then there was another kind of spark too, in that I was really disappointed in how Indian Health Services handled her care. She was often really kind of brushed aside. Not much attention was paid to her. There seemed to be a lot of frustration in her care. And, we as a family are also frustrated to see our loved one being treated with frustration. And so that kind of, really lit that fire that, I wanted to change that. And then when I was in high school, my grandmother then started developing dementia, which then progressed into Alzheimer's disease. And it just, kind of really gave me the strive to really understand, why does Alzheimer's disease and dementias are so prevalent into Native Americans? which Native Americans are actually the highest at risk for developing early onset dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And then along with African Americans are at highest risk overall for the development of Alzheimer's disease. So there, to answer that question, I really wanted to go in and study, like what is this Alzheimer's disease and potential therapeutics for it. And so that's what drove me to Wisconsin and where I picked my lab. So I actually worked with Luigi Pugalelli, who studies this mechanism within the cell called the endoplasmic reticulum and how to help proteins be made properly. So Alzheimer's disease is often associated with the beta amyloid plaques in the brain. And so this process, we found a way and a potential therapy to where we could clear those plaques. And so that's what I did my PhD in. And I hopefully, as NICC grows and, kind of expands their capabilities, I would like to be performing some, dementia and Alzheimer's research at NICC.
Thank you so much for explaining that. Those were all the questions.
Okay. I really appreciate the question, guys. So yeah, and I also have some built-in places too. So going back, so really looking at, there's a lot of hardships with Native Americans pursuing education, but, especially us, representing TCUs, we should really, kind of give Native Americans and Indigenous students and also, other students the resources to, enhance their education. So really revitalizing Indigenous knowledge, utilizing their knowledge rather than replacing it with conventional knowledge and maybe knowledge that we have learned in our time in academia. I know for myself that I really didn't learn Indigenous perspectives, coming into through my time at Oklahoma State, and then also at my time at UW. It was just, I kind of had to go out of my way to kind of pursue some of those papers and see what kind of research was going on, but it wasn't something that was incorporated within the classroom. This was stuff that I had to do outside on my own. And so us as TCUs, I feel that we should be, really, kind of advocating that Indigenous knowledge be incorporated and, not only within the TCU, but also make this a standard practice among all colleges and universities. So here I'm just sharing that, some different ways. So, Indigenous knowledge is so rich, and especially if you look at, potentially environmental sciences. So NICC, we have a lot of environmental research going on. So that's what I'm kind of highlighting here. But when it comes to things such as like traditional burning practices of different prairies and different lands, the way to maintain and take care of our land and our water, as we can remember, like things with like the Dakota Access Pipeline, advocating for our environment. We also had, hunting practices that followed the cues from nature rather than, what we decided was a need. So we really had these practices in both hunting and fishing in order to make sure that we weren't harming where we were getting our resources, that we were protecting it and making it stronger. And here is actually a knowledge symposium that was held, just a few weeks ago that I attended. And it was such a beautiful experience where we had these different professors who gave different insight. If you want to write down their name and look at more into their work, I highly recommend it. They were excellent presenters, gave great information, and they looked at land, water, and life and the critical role of Indigenous knowledge in environmental science. So really, it's, people like these, so, Dr. Reed, Dr. Chief, Dr. Adams, that they're starting to push forward this kind of cutting edge research where they're reincorporating traditional Indigenous knowledge. And the stuff that they're finding is starting to kind of come out like, okay, so we take the example of like indigenous burning of, kind of these different prairie lands. We find that, there's data coming out that the fire is actually needed for a lot of these native species to come back and to be, grow with vigor and be healthy. And that the fire allows for the soil to actually enhance its nutrients. And that it's this careful, period in which you burn the land that allows for these, kind of lost, hardly seen, almost extinct species to revitalize and come back. And this was knowledge, from these indigenous tribes that represented that area. And, you kind of have a lot of people that are like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would you burn to regrow? But there's actually a mechanism to this. And these tribes have been doing this for centuries before they were, told that they couldn't do it because, oh, there's a burn ban, or that's dangerous, or there's no need for that. Instead, we're actually starting to recover this lost knowledge that like, oh, yes, this is actually really important, that this ecosystem that's present here depends upon that fire at the certain time of year to be able to regrow. Other things are too is like fishing practices. So depending on when you decide to fish like a certain species within the Canada, they were able to find that the practice of fishing at certain points along, these rivers at certain times, certain age and certain amounts, which was practiced by those indigenous tribes, is actually more healthy for the fisheries than current, kind of those Western, standard practices, quote, quote. So there really is a lot of call into bringing traditional knowledge back. And there's a lot of strength that it's really helping revitalize like even our environment. So I wanted to share this with you guys because it's just, there's so much, knowledge that's still out there that, may not be recorded. A lot of indigenous practices are, passed down orally, or, they have been kind of smothered out because, people say like, okay, no, that's, we have a different rule. We don't think that works. But it turns out that these practices are actually, really, really vital for the environment and ecosystems that they're present within. And, us taking the time to listen to our students, to listen to the tribes we represent, the elders that are there, learn from them so we can also enhance that knowledge, that we can bring it to light, that these practices existed before, current Western standards were established. And we, it's worthwhile to take a look again and reincorporate these practices. I also even have, this is from the American Academy for Medical Colleges. There's also the other perspective that, everyone comes from a different background. Everyone walks a different path. As you're going along your path, you may notice different, kind of things along the way. Someone might notice a specific flower. Someone might notice a rock. Someone might notice the way the sky looks at a certain time of the day. And a lot of these little things through life as you're progressing and the way you view things is unique to you or unique to your group. And it's only that, diversity in which new things can be found. And so there's a lot of kind of push to really enhance diversity within like medical colleges, within colleges in general. And this diversity should be encouraged because it's these different perspectives in which new things are found. And especially whenever it comes, my background is more in the medical sciences. I did the neuroscience, and it's these, kind of little differences that you find to where some of these cures, some of these new ideas are being formed. And so really enhancing and advocating for our students and their perspectives is essential. And then just to share NICC's point of view. So NICC's mission statement is that the Nebraska Indian Community College provides quality higher education and lifelong educational opportunities for the Omaha and Asante Dakota and all learners. So that's, a mission statement that we share, that we essentially want to provide a pathway for all students, to be able to travel and learn. And to kind of tie it back in through the main title, so looking through the objective lens, given my background as, more of a scientist, the way I view this is that education has been focused on a single Western objective. And for those of you who don't know, when you think of a microscope, you can see these they kind of look like udders, and they have different intensities. So the closer you want to look at an object, you will change the objective in order to see more clearly your sample, like on the slide. So I believe that it is time to refocus, change the objective, and adjust the objectives to see the world through Indigenous perspectives. I think, we've been looking at, this one viewpoint for too long. It is time to flip that objective over and start highlighting what, the Indigenous people see. So now I'm just going to start with starting the semester off right. This is TCU faculty tips to prepare for teaching Indigenous students. I wanted to give this moment if there may be any questions.
I don't see any in the chat, but I do see a comment. Indigenous perspective could really go a long way in improving the efficiency and education on the students.
That's right. I believe so. And it's just, things are too standardized, especially when it comes to like academia. It's, really time to kind of take new perspectives and look at education in a different way. So I see going through on time. So just to give us time to have more questions later, I'll talk about starting the semester off. So really, as TCU faculty and staff, it's really important to get to know your TCU, to get to know who do you represent. So I just included some definitions about what a TCU is in general. So in the United States, tribal colleges and universities, otherwise known as TCUs, are a category of higher education minority serving institutions defined in the Higher Education Act of 1965. They're distinguished by being controlled and operated by federally recognized American Indian tribes. They have become part of American Indians institution building in order to pass on their own cultures. As of 2018, there are 32 fully accredited tribal colleges and universities in the United States, with one formal candidate for accreditation. So really knowing this definition, so even just looking at the definition of a TCU, we represent a federally recognized tribe, and it is important for us to represent those tribes in full. So really looking at, it's important to know what tribe or tribes does your TCU represent. So for NICC, we have the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and the Santee tribe of Nebraska. So those were our primary, when NICC was established, they were the ones who chartered the tribe. So they are the ones who helped establish a lot of the culture of NICC and the way we implement our current teachings. Recently, NICC had partnered with the Pawnee Nation College of Oklahoma, in which is chartered by the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. So now we're also incorporating Pawnee Nation into the mix. And so we have to be mindful of these different tribes, their practices, and just kind of the basic courtesy, like the basic rules of interacting with these peoples. So really going into important things to consider whenever you're designing your curriculum for the semester. It is important to be aware of cultural and ceremonial dates. This is a spring semester. So when was, the New Year's for these tribes? Do they have special ceremony regarding the New Year's? Whenever the rains come, do they have certain practices regarding that? If there's instances of, maybe even burial ceremonies, what are some of those common practices? What can you expect to see? And with that, you also want to keep in mind that if there are important dates, maybe the tribe has, a cultural ceremony or like maybe a powwow at a certain time, every year, maybe don't plan assignments that are, really heavy or tedious during that time, because you're going to have conflict of responsibility and you want your students to be able to represent themselves the best that they can. So don't create, hardships for them, especially if that's something you can avoid. Another thing is to really, the proper way to greet and acknowledge others. And this kind of goes along with common traditional practices. So many of these tribes have different ways to greet each other and etiquette. So you want to make sure that you're following specific etiquette, especially when it comes in regards to elders. Many of the times the elders are to speak first. And if you are to speak before an elder, it's common for NICC to, apologize for speaking ahead of the elders. So really making sure that you're paying attention to those, cultural practices and making sure that you're not being disrespectful. It's also useful, if you can, to understand some of the basic language skills and greetings. Many of the times the students just light up if you can greet them in their own language, and it just helps show that you're in tune with them and building that connection. It's also important to know some of the historical events, especially like if you have a tribe that may have been under forceful relocation. And that's a really significant thing, a part of the tribe and the culture, being really mindful of those and being thoughtful in the way you word some of your assignments, the way you speak about that event, if you speak about it, and, just trying to show that you respect. It's also important to, try to get to know the background of your students, maybe have your students share what background they come from. And this is also useful if there's conflict of perspectives. So there may be instances where you have two students who represent two different tribes, and they may have conflicting point of views, especially if you're in a situation where maybe they're talking about like religious practices or viewpoints. And then it really kind of think ahead how you can resolve those conflicts. It's kind of a lot of things to go through, but it's something that takes time. It takes a little bit of research, it takes a little bit of learning, but it really, will speak, for itself if you can just be mindful of your students and acknowledge them. So whenever you're going into planning the semester, if you can work to build on student strengths, not what's conventional. So if you have students who, many of these are non-traditional, maybe many of them go into a certain industry of work. Maybe there is either like a factory or maybe a hospital, grocer, something that is common with a lot of your students, that they get certain training in this particular field. Use those skills that they are learning and build upon that. Try to rework some of your assignments in order to incorporate things that they're familiar with, not necessarily what the textbook may say to go by. Another thing is to try to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the assignments. And what's really awesome is if you can actually get your students to share some of that knowledge with you. I think, kind of that point too, that so much history is, in someone's mind right now. It hasn't been written down or written down well. Try to encourage your students to document, or at least become aware that how important it is to document. Maybe, they have a grandmother who is an elder and being able to get that knowledge from them or talk about it, just to write it down for record purposes. That's such a great thing. I am teaching a nutrition class, and as an example of this, one thing that I do is for this nutrition class, their, kind of term project is that I want them, to pick a tribe, and then I want them to pick a time period. So whether it be up to date or maybe before the arrival of Columbus, certain periods, maybe early 1900s, during the relocation period, when the commodity program had been started, kind of picking these time periods and investigate what that tribe was eating during that time and how does that, compare to nutritional standards, and give insight on what differences there are and any explanations that they can find. So that's one of the assignments I have my students, and it's one that, they're kind of like, oh, I don't want to research, but I try to encourage them because, just what they find, they're researching things that haven't been written before, that these are things that, that would be so awesome for them to share and, to keep on record, like, hey, this is, an insight into this historical time period of this tribe. So another thing is to offer a variety of learning modes. So many students are non-traditional. It's been a long time since they could probably sit down and, read a textbook or sit on the computer. So, being able to offer things like just videos, hands-on, meeting in person, if you can do, even trips, maybe go to a museum, see if you can collaborate with a university that has a lab, let them see what a lot of this looks like in person, just giving them different ways to learn the best way they can. And then once again, be mindful of important assignment due dates and cultural events. And then also plan what to do if a student must miss class for cultural purposes or other instances. So many of these students are caregivers. And, since we're just coming out of these COVID times, there might be circumstances where these students aren't able to participate as they normally would. What are you going to do in those instances? And this is a brief reminder that many students are non-traditional, and to keep that in mind as you're planning. So this is kind of a built-in discussion time. So how do you prepare for the semester? This is also time I'll take some Q&A, but think briefly since we're getting low on time.
Yes, we do actually have a few questions about mainly, I'll read the question. Don't you think the Western perspective could be used alongside the Indigenous, because both have its own importance and effect on education?
Yes. So what I mean by is that could have been my wording. So it's what I mean by is I know many of us have learned the typical Western educational system with academia. What I meant by, kind of utilizing the Indigenous knowledge is, not completely in lieu of the Western, but to kind of, if you can make kind of that marriage. So use the Indigenous knowledge to build upon the points that, is kind of the standard of today within the Western education. That kind of makes sense. Because yes, many of us have learned, my education is, completely Westernized. It's very that standard, textbooks that I have sitting on my wall. But there's no Indigenous perspective. So it's kind of incorporating the Indigenous perspective when you can.
Wonderful. And also, we have another question on how possible is it to toe the line of teaching from the Indigenous perspective without reference to what is currently obtainable in the recent times?
That's an interesting question. So could you repeat that one more time?
Absolutely. How possible is it to toe the line of teaching from the Indigenous perspective without reference to what is currently obtainable in the recent times?
So I think that, it's very difficult to say, like, just on, um, kind of the indigenous perspective, because most of what we know and, kind of build upon, and then also what these students are going to encounter is the Western knowledge of things. And this kind of goes back to my previous comment, is that it's not necessarily only teaching the indigenous way, but rather give that indigenous perspective. So it's, kind of the opportunity to share, like, okay, this is how it traditionally is taught in, the academic setting, but here is that indigenous viewpoint upon it. So, many of the times when we're going through lessons, there's examples. If you can, and you have the resources to really include that indigenous perspective in your settings, instead of just giving the examples that you might see in the textbook.
Thank you. And those are all the questions that I was able to see.
Okay. We'll move on, and I might go a little bit quicker just for the sake of time. So looking at indigenizing the classroom, so bringing indigenous knowledge into the classroom. So really looking at, when you're going through the semester, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So it's really, I find that as I'm teaching, that flexibility is a useful tool. So things happen during the semester. For us at NICC, we have often a smaller class size. And so usually if something affects the tribe, it affects a lot of my students. And so, things that I might have planned to teach, or, assignments that might be due, it's really learning to work with your students. It's not giving them, kind of like free reign. You still want to guide them towards the knowledge that they need to learn for the semester. But it's really, being understanding, being able to communicate with your students. So keeping that communication open, and then also encouraging to kind of get in your students' shoes. So really understanding, if you can learn about them, or at least, kind of understand that they might have circumstances. Oftentimes students go to you for their guidance, and they might explain circumstances in which they're struggling with. And really what you need to do is, like, to try to be respectful and try to provide the accommodation that you can to allow them to continue their education. I also find that repetition in multiple modes is highly successful. So I might tell them, a bit of knowledge, I present this PowerPoint, and I have it here. But if it's an important, topic, and I know that it's one that might be hard to understand, I often try to include like videos or resources. Many sites now have like even games you can play to try, different subjects, certain like quizzes. So really try to offer, those key points in different ways to help your students retain that knowledge. And then also give your students the opportunity to share their knowledge. Really encourage that discussion, encourage them, to kind of share the way that they view the assignment, get them, like also encourage like participation. If you're covering something, don't hesitate to call in a student and, say, hey, can you summarize what was just said? How do you view this? Or what do you think about it? Give them opportunity to discuss this material, and this will help them better retain. One example that I'm sharing here, this is actually a recent graduate from UW-Madison. So this is Dr. Sterling Blake Martin, and he started Project Enable. So it's enriching Navajo as a biology language for education. So he was in, I forget the exact program, but he was in a cell-based program at UW. And what he found, especially coming from, the Dene Reservation, is that there weren't really, it was hard for him to talk to his family about what he was studying. And so he took this initiative to be able to translate key biology into Dene. And so it's like utilizing these resources, or even coming up with these resources that is, highly valuable to these students. and incorporating and being able to explain, what they're learning to not only themselves, but their community. So the next part is a little bit short too. So I'm going to keep moving, and then see if there's any time for Q&A. I know we're right there at the end. But next part is that feedback is good. So learning from your students to help your future students. So, being in education, I feel that we're on a path of a lifelong learner. So history is continually being written and technology is continually adapting. So really, updating the information that we have and updating our resources. So it's really important to update curriculum routinely, incorporate students' knowledge that you've learned and grown with during the semester, encourage discussion and feedback from students, and then also try to take the initiative to create resources for students. And so with that, I'll kind of go ahead. So I have a Kix diet, which means thank you and Pani. So I'm happy to take any questions if there's time for it. But otherwise, I thank you guys for inviting me to speak and, taking the time to listen to me.
Yes, thank you. We actually have one question. A large class where there are students with diverse cultural, religious backgrounds, how would one carry each and everyone along?
Yeah, it is, very difficult with the larger classrooms. And that's, it is a challenge. I don't have a perfect answer for that. I think the key, at least that I find if I'm handling, a bit of a larger classroom is, the potential to have the students and maybe work in groups. So, not necessarily group them, based off of a certain aspect, but maybe group them and have them, kind of discuss and evaluate each other, or at least share, kind of these combined reports, allow them to, kind of work together on a project, give the feedback of the group. And so that way you can kind of gain perspective over the students. And a lot of it too is if you have the opportunity to go into like maybe an advising role, to learn more about as the students go along. Yes, it is a difficult thing. I don't have, like I said, the perfect answer. If anyone else has successful tips about, kind of working with each student in a larger group, I welcome it. But yeah, it's just what I found is that I find group work and then just kind of having the groups do some feedback and being able to see what their perspective was.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Megan. What a great presentation. One, I learned so many great new things. So thank you, Dr. Miri Mazariegos. Our sponsors, General Motors, and our participants. Right now, actually, if you would like to take one of our TCU mini conferences, very similar to this one, to your campus, we are actually looking for a partner at TCU to host an in-person TCU mini conference. This mini conference would include a community meal and networking session, a TCU STEM faculty workshop with lunch included, and a TCU STEM student workshop with lunch included as well. To get more information, you're more than welcome to contact me, Elizabeth Johnson, the Native Initiatives Coordinator, by emailing me at Elizabeth, ELISABETH @sacnis.org. I also dropped an announcement into the chat. If you can, please confirm your attendance by clicking that link and filling out all that information. If you enjoyed today's webinar, you can find more upcoming and previous webinar recordings on our website at sacnis.org/webinars. This concludes our webinar with Dr. Miri Mazariegos. Thank you for taking your time to join us, and we'll see you next time.